Did Jesus Christ actually exist in history? Minimal historicity, minimal mythicism. Well, according to Kamil Gregor today, he has the Achilles heel to mythicism. He believes the probability is on the side of historicity, and that there's more probability that there was a historical person at the basis of Christianity than there is mythicism. I want you guys to see that obviously both sides see the evidence is convoluted. There's obviously all sorts of issues when it comes to the evidence of Jesus, and Kamil does not disagree. At the same time, the probabilities that he uses is the same methodology that was taught by Dr. Carrier. If you guys have not read his book on the historicity, go down in the description and make sure you get it. He's also been on this YouTube channel as well. And we're big fans of both of these guys. We are all about open-minded discussion, and these discussions should be there without having contention. And that's what we're all about here in MythVision, open to dialogue. Make sure you guys go check out Doug at Pine Creek's channel. Subscribe to his channel because I'm a huge fan of his. I watch his YouTube channel religiously. He's awesome, man. His stuff is great. Check him out. Check Cam out. Check Kamil out. Cam has a Discord group. Down in the description, you guys can go and join that. It's like a chat room to talk about these ideas freely. And there is no judgment. They'll tell you what they think though, but make sure you guys go join that as well. The Discord group's actually pretty cool. I've already been in it myself. Make sure you guys like this video, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell, and comment down below your thoughts of this channel or this video that I'm about to do. I have a Patreon, so if you guys want to be members of MythVision and join MythVision Podcast and help us out with what we're doing, you can go and join our MythVision Podcast Patreon. We are MythVision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Your host, Eric Lambert. I have a treat today, and it's going to be a very, I guess you'd say, intense program here from our friend here, Kamil. And I would butcher your name if I tried to say it in its original tongue. But thank you for joining me.
Thank you. You did very well.
I really appreciate you joining me. It's really an honor to be able to listen to you. I've been watching you on Doug, Pine Creek Doug. For those of you who are not aware of his YouTube channel, you need to be aware because he has a lot of interesting guests and he talks about a lot of very important issues and topics that are pertinent to Christianity and what is going on in fundamentalist circles and how to deal with apologetics and the apologist out there. He has all sorts of interesting stuff. So make sure you guys go subscribe, like, comment on his videos. That helps his channel grow. And also up front, Cam, who's another special guest that shows up on Doug's channel, has a Discord. It's down in the description of this video. If you guys like Discord or you're not sure, it's like a chat room area where you can go, and Cam has tons of information, academic information for you guys to learn more about the pertinent issues that we deal with the Bible. I mean, lots of topics. So welcome to the show, Kamil. And what are you bringing for us today? I'm interested.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, let me just say upfront, I'm an atheist, so that we are going to be talking about Jesus mythicism. So I just want to clarify that, I don't believe in the Christ of faith, right? So when we're talking about Jesus who was born of a virgin, walked on water, was raised from the dead, yeah, that is a myth. He didn't exist. But I would describe myself as a minimal mythicist, which means I believe that there probably was a Jewish religious leader named Jesus who during his life acquired some followers and he was crucified by the Romans. And some of his followers became convinced for whatever reason that he rose from the dead, and the rest is history, right? And the reason why I'm here today is because at some point, I think a couple of months ago, I had a conversation with Joel, who you had on recently, who is a mythicist. And we were talking about the historicity of Jesus, and I happened to mention Richard Carrier, and who is, of course, a prominent mythicist, historian. And he later wrote a review of the conversation that's actually about 40 pages long. And I was completely blown away by this because I'm not a professional scholar. And I thought, Richard Carrier has more important things to do than write about me. So I felt obligated to repay the hours that he must have spent writing about me. But the problem is that I have a job, so I don't have as much free time as him. But I do have a draft of a blog post It's not a response to his review. It's just some thoughts that I have about his work, given that I disagree with his conclusion. But the problem is I haven't had a chance to finish it and publish it. But then you asked me to come on your show, and I decided this might be a good opportunity to kind of tease what might be in the blog post when it's finished, and let's see what people think about it, right? So that's why I'm here.
Well, thank you for joining me here. And I know that recently, because by the way, I haven't read that whole blog post. I just know that he had mentioned you. Not really, I didn't really delve into reading the whole thing. I was just told, hey, he did mention Kamil in a blog post and mentioned something about his methodology when it comes to Bayesian theory and how that affects history, or how he's using it towards mythicism, which he writes like a large portion of his book on the historicity is about that. And I know that you actually disagree with his conclusions. And I think you mentioned that in the video with Joel, even though I didn't watch the whole video either. I have not actually spent my time doing that. I'm here to host you and hear why you actually ultimately disagree with his theory on mythicism. And it's not like a heated, contentious thing. You've come up with different ideas. You sent me this chart. Not sure when you want me to have that pop up, but
Yeah, let's do it later. Yeah, it's interesting to say. It's important to say that like the conversation that I had with Joel that started all of this was just. I mean, it was on his channel. It was off the cuff, and a couple hundred people saw it, maybe more now. So yeah, I was really surprised that well, Richard Carrier, of all people, given that neither me or Joel are like people of any importance, um, pays attention to it. So yeah, I mean, the reason why I'm doing this is because I feel obligated to, give some of the effort that he put into thinking about my thoughts back to him. So yeah, I hope this is going to be productive.
I hope
So
so
yeah,
too. I want to
yeah,
tell everybody that you are the intellectual artillery behind the Pine Creek Doug YouTube
absolutely.
channel. So if you
Yeah.
want to know where he's getting some of his fire from, Camille's the man. And by the way, I want to mention this up front for our audience. A lot of people ask me, what do you believe, Derek? And honestly, I'm agnostic. I I tell this to Dr. Price all the time. I'm a big fan of him. I love his skepticism. Now, is he overly skeptic at time? I'm sure. I mean, he's reading some of these, very, very critical scholars, German critical scholars that like are very nitpicky about certain details. And I've heard that said, but to me, I'm going to start with absolute skepticism and work my way into what I can find that makes sense. And so I'll wake up on the wrong side of the bed and I think, well, you know what, damn it, there was a Jesus. I just don't know much about him except he was Jewish maybe and like whatever. And then other times I'm like minimal mythicism and I wrestle with this idea. So I'm going to be taking notes from you today and learning from you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can definitely appreciate that, right? Like, who wouldn't like Richard Price? Sorry, Bob Price. First of all, he's such an adorable teddy bear, and also I'm a huge Lovecraftian fan, so that's
Nice.
bonus points right there. And I don't personally have any problems with Richard Carrier, unlike other people. I think he's my favorite Ben Shapiro impersonator. So I hope this is going to be a very cordial discussion. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of clarify a little bit more where I'm at, I wouldn't say like that. Even when we talk a minimal Jesus, right? So you take the Jesus that he's depicted in the New Testament and outside the Bible, and you just strip him to a bare minimum. To a point when it even makes sense to talk about a person who actually existed. I'm not like 100% confident that he did. It's more a question of probability. And I like to say that like on good days, I'm basically 50-50. So I wake up being completely agnostic, probably as the same way you are. But on bad days, I would put myself somewhere around 70% probability of that person actually existing, which is not very strong. It's probably like my level of confidence is much lower than well, certainly most New Testament scholars, right? Because they kind of take it for granted. But I think, it's even though we are not, like nobody's claiming to be absolutely certain one way or the other, it's important to realize that sometimes people kind of take it to the opposite extreme. And just because we can't know for sure one way or the other, they just jump to complete agnosticism, and they kind of just give up and conclude that, yeah, we can't say either way. I think we can be a little bit more ambitious than that, and we can say, okay, even though we can't be certain, there are things that we can know with less than absolute certainty. Ancient history is one of them. So let's look at the evidence, and let's see if we end up being, if we end up thinking that the probability is higher than not, or the other way around, right? Cool. So let me just maybe briefly talk about some of the thoughts that I want to share, if that's okay with you, and maybe you can tell me what you think about it. You can maybe try to poke some holes, because there might very well be something that I overlooked, and you will point it out. But it's okay. I
I'll
mean, this is a
try, I
learning
guess.
experience for everyone. Yeah. So here's just like I have let's say a couple of issues with Carrier's work. Some of it has to do with some of the pieces of the evidence he analyzes, but I thought I would just simplify it and just focus on the question of prior probability, right? Because when it comes to, and I noticed that when it comes to the discussion about the historical Jesus, people very often focus a lot on the quality and quantity of evidence. And it's true that for a lot of characters who show up in ancient Greco-Roman literature, we have even less evidence than we do for Jesus. Like, for example, there are ancient characters who are first mentioned in Suda, which is a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, which means that in some cases, they are actually first mentioned over 1,000 years after they supposedly lived, right? Like, imagine if Jesus was like that, if he was first mentioned not in like decades after his death, supposedly, but 1,000 years, right? But historians still think that some of these people existed, even though the evidence is so bad. And the question is why? And it has to do with the prior probability, right? So when you are evaluating a hypothesis, there are essentially two components to the process. There is the evaluation of the actual evidence, and there is the question of prior probability. And in this case, when we are evaluating a hypothesis of a historical person existing, even if someone has a very poor evidence of his existence, we can still conclude that he probably existed if the same sorts of people like him usually existed and are very rarely fictional, right? So, for example, we know of a couple hundred ancient historiographers, and many of them are only mentioned hundreds and hundreds of years after they supposedly lived. But we also have a lot of examples of his ancient historiographers we know existed, and there are only very few ancient historiographers who are fictional. So when we just come across another ancient historiographer, we think, yeah, the probability that he's typical and not exceptional is probably very high. So yeah, even though the evidence is pretty poor, we are still reasonable to conclude that this person is typical and not exceptional, and so he probably existed, even though we can't say one way or the other with absolute confidence or with absolute certainty, right? Unless, of course, there is a very strong evidence that this specific character, for some reason, is the exception and didn't actually exist. And I think this is the same with Jesus. And Richard Carrier essentially does the same thing. So when he's thinking about prior probability, he puts Jesus into a group of ancient characters. So people show up in Greco-Roman literature, and he looks at the group, and he finds out that all the people in the group didn't exist. So he thinks that Jesus is probably not an exception. Probably didn't exist either, right? Or at least his assessment of the prior probability is very low. And then he argues that the evidence is not strong enough to actually overcome that low prior probability.
And this is rank Raglan, right? He's using the rank Raglan.
So in the book, the historicity of Jesus, he uses the rank Raglan heroes. These are heroes that supposedly follow some mythotype. So there is a list of attributes that they usually meet. These would be people like Moses, Theseus, Perseus, Zeus, Bellerophon, Asclepius, Romulus, Hercules, of course, Osiris, maybe some other people. And when he's giving talks, he often talks about Jesus in relation to the dying and rising gods, right? So like Baal, again Osiris, Inanna, Hercules, Dionysius, Asclepius, Zalmoxis, Adonis, right? So gods that die somehow and then somehow are revived, right? And again, obviously, if you put Jesus into that group of people or characters, you find out that they are all fictional, right? Like we don't think that Osiris actually existed, so Jesus probably didn't exist as well, or at least the probability is very low. But there, when I was thinking about it, I think there is something that he might overlooked, and this is where the picture comes into play. So if you can put it on the screen and kind of have it in there for a while,
Yeah,
that would
absolutely.
be great.
Here we go. Hold on. Let me pop it up. And you should be seeing this.
Yeah, I do. So, so what I noticed is that so when you look at characters that appear in Greco-Roman and ancient Jewish literature and share some similarity to Jesus, so they are sons of gods, demigods, incarnation of pre-existing gods, miracle workers, Jewish religious leaders, people who are depicted as culminations of messianic expectations, and you kind of put them on a timeline based on when they are depicted as living on Earth, you essentially get this trend, right? So we are basically looking at when the character is depicted as living, not when the literature about him was written. So for example, the Iliad is usually dated to the second half of the 8th century, but the characters in the Iliad are like the story actually takes place at the end of the Bronze Age. So I think 12th or 13th century, right? So the composition of the work is like 300 years removed from the events that it depicts. So in this case, we would be putting Hector and Achilles to the 13th century. So this is what I'm talking about, right? When the character is depicted as living. And when you do that, for all of these characters that are somehow similar to Jesus, share some important similarity, you get this distribution. And you can see that a lot of the characters who didn't exist are depicted as living in very distant past, when almost nobody who is depicted as living back then existed, regardless of whether he is similar to Jesus or not. Like if you think about the Bible, for example, and you think about the characters who showed up at the very beginning of the book, like Adam, Abraham, Moses, we don't think that they existed. But if you actually go through to very or more recent history, then you start getting people who historians think are probably real people, right? And it's the same with Greco-Roman literature. So I noticed that all of the examples that Carrier gives, so for example, all of the examples in his rank recline class, and all of the examples of his dying and rising gods, are actually characters who are depicted as living on Earth in a very, very distant past. But if you actually look at people who are similar to Jesus, but they are depicted as living in a more recent time, roughly around the same period as Jesus, they almost always existed. So the kinds of claims that are told about Jesus, even though we know they are not true, were usually told about people who existed, and they were much less often told about fictional characters. So for example, we have examples of sons of gods, right? Like Alexander or Augustus Caesar. We have examples of demigods or incarnations of pre-existing gods like Apollonius of Tyana. We have examples of miracle workers. We have, of course, many examples of Jewish religious leaders, people who are depicted as culminations of messianic expectations. And when they are depicted as living around the same period of time as Jesus, they are almost always historical. So when you kind of take Carrier's assessment of prior probability and you update it by bringing in this additional factor, which is like a very strong predictor of historicity, I think you end up with a revised prior probability that is actually very low, very high. which means that even if you then agree with Carrier that the evidence is not very strongly pointing in either direction, which this is what he's arguing, well, then you end up concluding that Jesus probably existed, because the sorts of people like him usually existed. So yeah.
Interesting. No. This is this is interesting, because I guess it'd be good not to run to the Gospels to try and like start there and say, hey, okay, I do see a lot of parallel, or a lot of commonality, if you will, between Jesus from the Gospels and a lot of these older, stories. There's a lot in common that you find from Osiris, Asclepius, Hercules, Dionysus, and I've been recently reading Dennis R. MacDonald. But even you aren't factoring the Gospels. You're saying, look, we're not even talking about the Gospels necessarily. If you want to get to the meat of the crux of the argument, let's look at Paul. And in Paul, you're also suggesting there's enough here to say there was probably a guy, probably. And you start with a good prior probability, higher than he does in his book. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, he starts with like, there's a third, like 33 or 30%, something like, it's like a 1/3 chance that Jesus existed. And I think he concludes with that at the end. He says it's 1 out of 3. And you're saying something more like 2 out of 3, right? You're like saying,
so this is important to get correctly, because there is a little bit of confusion. So on the historicity of Jesus, Carrier actually gives 2 sets of probability estimates for essentially every data point. So every piece of evidence, and the prior probability, and then of course the posterior. One of them is what he calls, or like what he thinks is the absolutely most generous he can be to historicity. So if you bend yourself backwards to be as charitable as possible to the idea that Jesus existed, then if I remember correctly, his estimate of the prior probability is 1 in 3. And then he thinks that the evidence, if you take this approach, is ambiguous. So on balance, it doesn't really very strongly point in either direction. Like some pieces of evidence he thinks are more probable in historicity, some are more probable in mythicism, but it kind of balances out. So it ends up, he ends up with essentially the prior 1 in 3. But then there is the second set of probability estimates, which he thinks are his honest assessment, right? So if he's not being super charitable to historicity on purpose, then this is what he gets. And there, I think the estimate of the prior probability is much, much lower. And then what's important is that his the evaluation of evidence is much more in favor of mythicism in his opinion. So he actually ends up with a posterior which is very, very high. It's like over 99%. I think it's 99.9 something, right? And I obviously disagree with that. But I noticed that when he's talking about this, like when he's giving lectures, he almost never mentions the estimates that he thinks are his like honest actual estimates. He always says he thinks the prior probability, the probability is 1 in 3. So I'm just a mythicist. Sorry, I'm just a historicist. So if he wants me, if he wants to throw me a bone and be super charitable to my view, I'm going to take it, right?
Right.
So yeah, he would say, like, if he was here right now, probably, given the talks that he's gave since the book was out, he would say, yeah, I'm just saying, the probability is somewhere around 1 in 3. And I would, yeah, as I said, I would go either 50-50 or somewhere between 50-50 and like 70-30. And this is not rocket science, right? Like, we don't have any exact numbers. We don't have any extremely large data sets, anything like that. There are problems with all kinds of biases, like obviously the ancient literature that we have available is very fragmentary, so we are not sure if these distributions were the case in the entire body of ancient literature that ever existed. But yeah, I mean, if you take this into account, this is what you end up with, I think.
So what I'm looking at here is, in his book on the historicity, he's using these, I guess you'd say, 8th century, or if you will, very old myths that if there was a person, or if there was ever a historical person, it's so far in antiquity. At this point, we conclude they probably didn't exist until we have evidence otherwise. Kind of like we did with Troy. We didn't think it existed till we found more reason to believe there was a city. And just an example, or I mean, because it looks to me that he, according to what you're saying here, he didn't factor in some of these like closer to like Jesus ben Ananias, Simon of Perea, these figures in his book. Did he not cover those? Because the prior probability all matters on what you're going to conclude when you start with something extremely low and you don't factor in some of these other things.
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually. So I'm not saying that he didn't take into account the specific ancient characters. What I'm saying is that he didn't take into account like a specific trend, like a specific, very strong predictor of whether an ancient character was historical or fictional.
Okay.
And it seems to me that this predictor is when the character is depicted as living. Because all of the examples that he gives of characters that are similar to Jesus, and that some of them he places in the same reference class, and that's how he estimates the prior probability, like all of those people are actually depicting as living in extremely distant past. And the problem is that almost everyone, I would say in ancient Greco-Roman literature, everyone that's depicting as living around that period of time is fictional. And it doesn't matter if they are similar to Jesus or not. So I think he might actually be like the reason why these people are fictional is not because they are similar to Jesus. It's because of when they are depicted as living, right? Like if you just run through the list. It's actually interesting because Greeks had a very sophisticated chronology of their own mythology, right? They thought obviously that all of these mythical characters existed, so they were wondering when they lived, and they put together very comprehensive view. So there was like a timeline, and you could place some events that never exist, like never took place, in like exact years, right? So for example, like the Trojan War is usually dated to either mid 12th or mid 13th century BCE, according to these Greek chronologies of ancient history, even though there probably wasn't a Trojan War, right? At least not as it's depicted.
Right.
And a second point is, it's very important to realize again that what I'm describing is not about the gap between when the events take place and when the literature is written, right? So the reason why the characters who existed in very distant past probably never existed is not necessarily because like the first sources about them were written very late. And the reason why the people who are depicted as living in like a more recent past are almost or historical is not because the sources that are mentioning them are closer to their own lives. I think there are other reasons. Like there are specific reasons that have to do with literary conventions for why this trend exists. Like just as an example, one of the reasons why the trend is like that is because when authors of Greco-Roman literature and ancient Jewish literature invented fictional characters, specifically fictional characters that share similarities to Jesus, they usually depicted him as living in very, very distant past. Like one example is Seneca, who is roughly contemporaneous with Jesus, who wrote roughly about the same around the same period of time as Paul, and he writes about gods who never existed. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't invent a new god, and he doesn't depict that god as living in his own time or like 30 years before his own time.
Right.
He writes about Medea, who is a character depicted as in very distant past. He writes about Jason. He writes about Athena, stuff like that. So it seems to me this just wasn't something that these people did. It could be, of course, the case that Jesus is exceptional, and there are reasons why the authors of the New Testament and the founders of Christianity did that, even though other people in their own time didn't do it. But exceptions are by definition improbable. Like they are infrequent, so they are improbable. And if they were not infrequent, we would have more examples like that, and we don't,
Right.
it seems to.
So if you don't mind me asking a question, because this actually comes to kind of a root problem I found with the New Testament and this whole trying to figure who the guy is, trying to find the historical Jesus for me. It's strange to me, and I'm sure you probably share this, this like eager, like, why Paul is like following and worshiping this forgiving, dying and rising guy, Jesus, if he only died 20 years ago. To me, 20, 30 years ago from the time he wrote, to me, and I'm not saying it's not possible. I had Rabbi Tovia Singer come on, and he was like, have you ever heard of cognitive dissonance, Derek? And I'm like, yes. But he's like, I don't know if you know the power of cognitive dissonance, but anyway, it's a very powerful thing. But how a theological system has developed around this guy in such a short amount of time, to me, is just, it's amazing. I mean, if he is a historical guy from the 30s, it's amazing. And so I factor in these different ideas, and I just have I have a hard time like swallowing that pill. And I don't know if you've experienced the same thing as me when it comes to this man named Paul, who somehow wasn't in direct communication with the Jesus on earth, but he had known maybe of disciples who were, has this dying and rising. Did he recreate an earlier movement? Is this like a mystery school blend attaching itself to a guy in history? I just have a hard time wondering how he has such high theology in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm just wondering if if mythicism really solves that problem, like if it's a much better alternative, because on mythicism, you would have to push the actual origins, like unknown origins of Christianity, farther back in time in order to solve that problem, right? So you would need more time for this theology to develop. And then, of course, you have the problem of like these people became convinced that this person, there is this divine being uh, that never existed, right? So if you, for example, think that Paul became convinced that Jesus is the Messiah, he is this divine being because he had some kinds of experience and he concluded that this is true, well, then it doesn't matter if there was a historical Jesus or not. Like in that case, events play exactly the same way, right? So yeah, I'm not really sure how like mythicism solves that problem, and it's definitely true. And Carrier writes about this very extensively, that you can essentially, it seems to me, that to a large degree, you can piece together the core of New Testament theology from the Old Testament and from essentially Second Temple Jewish beliefs, right? Like,
Yes.
so there could be some tangential evidence, like in some cases better, in some cases worse, that, for example, the Son of Man was already identified with the Messiah before Christianity started, or that like Daniel was already interpreted as depicting a dying Messiah. You can argue, for example, that the Son of Man was already identified with the suffering servant from Isaiah before Christianity started, right? But again, like if you are convinced of this, then doesn't really make any difference if there was a guy who these theological ideas were associated with or not, right? Like
Right.
then history essentially plays exactly the same way. It doesn't really seems to me that one is extremely more probable than the other.
It wouldn't matter. Right. I get what you're saying. So whether there was a historical guy, and that's why like I like to put it, just my opinion, and I love how you're factoring in this evidence. I always put like there's a 50-50 chance he was either a historical guy or he's not a historical guy, kind of like the creation arguments that Christians come in. Well, look, dude, you've got a 50-50 chance God either did it or he didn't do it, right? So I'm just playing that role. But I start with that guess, and you bring up a good point that I think, if you don't mind me sharing something else that me and my buddy, I can't name him, we were talking about some of these things, and talking about the prior probability concepts and why you start with a higher, and now everybody can see why you start with a higher probability than the low probability that Dr. Carrier brings in. Let me share this screen with you. Here we go. So Bayesian calculator right here is interesting. So you start with 0.67 approximately, or something like that, just to give a rough calculation. That's pretty much 2/3 rather than 1/3, if you will. Instead of starting with like 1 out of 3 chance that, historicity is the case, it's a 2 out of 3, and you're still giving a 33% chance technically that, mythicism could be the case. But when you factor in a lot of these ideas here, that should change the prior probability, and ultimately you come up with a different conclusion than Dr. Carrier does. So I wanted to show that real quick, if you didn't mind. Some
Yeah,
of these
absolutely.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's important to still realize that we are talking about the prior probability, which is like one component, and then there is a lot of individual pieces of evidence where they have, like, each individual piece of evidence has its own probability estimate, which essentially it tells you whether it supports historicity or mythicism, right? It's more likely that the evidence would look like the way it does if historicity was true or mythicism was true. And that, of course, takes into account absence of evidence as well, right? Like if we have, for example, something that doesn't exist, but we think it should, if historicity is true, well, then that's evidence for mythicism, right? So it's absolutely true that it could be the case that if you start with a very high prior probability, you still end up thinking that Jesus probably didn't exist if you think that the evidence is favoring mythicism. And we could go through these individual pieces of evidence and talk about it one by one. Because when I just take the numbers from Carrier's book, go through them, in some of the cases I basically agree completely. I don't have anything substantial to say. In some cases I would put the probability differently. Like, for example, I agree with his, like, the direction, but I think the magnitude is incorrect. Like, I would probably put the probability estimate, like, for example, favoring historicity or favoring mythicism the same way he does, but I would just make that hypothesis favor more. And in some cases, I just disagree with the direction, right? I think what's sometimes the case that he just jumps to the conclusion that a given piece of evidence is expected on mythicism, because if Jesus didn't exist, then the people were free to invent, the relevant people were free to invent kind of whatever they wanted, right? But I think some of the pieces of evidence which he thinks are expected on mythicism are actually at least equally unexpected on mythicism as they are on historicity. But this is something that I kind of want to avoid, right? Because then you are playing a whack-a-mole and you're just jumping from, like, one piece of evidence to the other.
Right.
And also, when you start talking about evidence, it tends to get bogged down to extremely, like, minute details about interpretations of Galatians 1:19 and whether it says other than the apostles or other of the apostles in the original Greek and stuff like that, right? Like, I never want to have another discussion about brother of the Lord, because this is something that people bring up all the time. Because,
Yeah.
like, I have to say, most historicists, like most people, even people who are casually interested in ancient history, don't actually know how to argue Jesus' historicity. And they think specifically that there are just a couple of knockdown arguments, usually like knockdown passages, that you can point to. And it just proves that immediately that Jesus existed, like Testimonium Flavianum, the rules of the age, Jesus was denied Jesus was handed over,
Right.
like various things. And because they don't actually care to read what someone like Richard Carrier has to say, they are not aware that mythicists have actually done a lot of work around these passages, right? So that's why these debates are usually always about these couple of small passages. That's why I like to focus more on the prior probability, because it's much more interesting. And to be honest, I think that that there is probably like a substantial objection. Um, because it seems to me that there is at least one very strong predictor of historicity that is not taken into account.
I got one more chart I got to bring up, if you're okay. And this one's actually
Sure.
goes in line of what you're discussing here, because what it appears to be is minimal historicity has more explanatory power. Even if you do think something is mythology, it doesn't take away that there may have been a historical root to it. So like begotten of a woman, begotten under the law. One could say it's allegory, minimal mythicism. It still doesn't mean that this couldn't have been really a guy that they're making a allegory about. So it's kind of like minimal historicity kind of outweighs the overall evidence.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? No matter what.
Exactly. Yes. So this is also very important. Like again, this has to do with evaluation of the evidence, not the prior probability, right? So this is the part of the discussion
I don't mean
that
to
I
do
want
this
to
to
avoid.
you.
But that's okay, right? But this is like a more important meta point, right? So as you mentioned very correctly, there is a lot of pieces of evidence which could potentially favor historicity, but there isn't any like silver bullet, right? You can always kind of argue around it. You can say it's an interpolation, it wasn't in the original text, there's multiple ways how to interpret it. So you can always wiggle around it, because that's why mythicists exist, right? Like if there was a silver bullet, mythicism wouldn't be around.
Right.
The problem is that seems to me that out of all of the possible readings that are on the table, only some of them must be true for mythicism to go through, and minimal historicity is usually able to accommodate a much more alternatives, right? So when you look at, for example, the night in which he was handed over, it can mean a number of different things. But the problem is that for mythicism to be true, and specifically Carrier's mythicism to be true, it must mean Jesus was handed over to the powers of Satan
By God.
in lower heavens on like a sublunar orbit, right? Like almost any other alternative makes at least minimal mythicism much less probable, right? Which would be fine if we were just talking about one piece of evidence. The problem is there is so many of them, right? So it becomes like the problem with conjunction, right? Mythicism can only go through if a lot of these individual pieces of evidence are interpreted in a very small number, usually, particular ways. While historicity is much more flexible. Like I have absolutely no problem in many of these instances with the idea, for example, that the language in question is allegorical, because Jesus, it could be the case that Paul is talking allegorically, and there still was a historical Jesus. But a mythicist cannot do the same thing in reverse. He cannot say, yeah, Paul wasn't talking allegorically, he was talking about the real guy, but Jesus still didn't exist, right? That's still possible, but it's admittedly much less probable. I was reminded of this, like the same problem. I don't know if you know Mike Winger. He's a Christian. Yeah, he's a Christian apologist, and he recently did a video about flat Earth in the Bible. Because, as we all know, obviously the Bible teaches flat Earth.
Yeah.
That was the standard cosmological model in the ancient Near Eastern world and in the ancient Greek world as well. Like in, for example, Homer and Hesiod, the world is flat. It even gives you the specific dimensions. So that's not ambiguous. The problem is, of course, that if you are a Christian apologist, you have to do a lot of explaining. And the way how he goes about it is he lists the passages that are usually pointed to by Christians who believe in flat Earth as evidence for flat Earth. And he says that in every single instance of a passage like that, there is a potential meaning that can salvage the idea that the Earth is a globe. So you can always wiggle your way out of it. But the problem is that there is so many passages where you have to do this much work. And they would have to all be true at the same time. Because if there is even one passage where the author really did think that the earth is flat, then the Bible does really teach a flat earth, at least in that one passage, right? And this is kind of equivalent because, yeah, there is a lot of different pieces of evidence which are ambiguous. But the problem is that if even one of them favors historicity, well, then historicity becomes much more probable. So like a mythicist needs to tweak a lot of knobs at the same time. And I think us historicists don't have to do it nearly as much, right? So yeah.
Good point. That's a great point, Camille, because there's, like I mentioned prior to the show, that I'd like to get a book out for that whole movement that I was talking about that thinks all genetic descendants of Abraham are the Gentiles. They're lost Israelites in the New Testament. They're being saved. If you find one place where somewhere in the New Testament it does teach that the message goes beyond the scope of the 12 tribes, genetic descendants, then what you could conclude at that point is there was a original Jewish only movement that evolved into something much bigger. And I think that is what we're going to probably conclude, but I don't want to presuppose before I have evidence to make a case, because I mean, why did the church develop into what it is today? If there wasn't differences of Christianity, different types of opinions that began to evolve and different churches developed. And eventually, of course, pagans, lock, stock, and barrel started to swallow this pill and said, hey, this is the way, we're going to believe in this. Non-Israelites started to believe it. So anyway, I like what you did there, because, you know, I always tell people sometimes it isn't the idea that we're proposing that's wrong. It might have that teaching in certain places, but the text itself, you know, trying to harmonize the text itself. I'm not trying to rabbit trail into undesigned coincidences or anything like that, but we harmonize so much to try to make things work. I'm trying to be more critical today in my thinking and learning from, you know, very good scholars on how to approach this information. So if you found a historical Jesus anywhere, then it does hype up the probability that there was someone that started this thing, or at least it's based off of.
Yeah, well, I mean, someone started it, right? The question is if he was named Jesus and he was crucified. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. Like, people tend to do this kind of thing with all kinds of stuff, right? Like conspiracy theories, yeah, flat Earth, different religious interpretations. Like Calvinists do it with some biblical passages, Armenians, open theists, right? Like, the one thing I think that people tend intuitively, like one mistake that people intuitively make is that when they come across a passage which is ambiguous as to whether it supports their hypothesis or an alternative, they say, well, okay, it's ambiguous, so the chances are 50-50, right? But the problem is that it's very often the case that, like, there is a range of possible meanings that a passage might have, and your hypothesis can only accommodate a very small range. And the alternative can accommodate a much more, much broader range, right? Like when you, for example, think Paul saying something, Jesus was born of a woman. Well, Carrier, in order for his minimal mythicism to go through, pretty much has to argue that Paul was talking metaphorically, that he wasn't talking about, you know, actual woman, whether she was named Mary or not, right? That could be from later tradition. But I, as a historicist, don't have to do it. I can say, okay, maybe he's talking about the real person that actually existed, like a biological mother, or maybe he's just being metaphorical, right? Like, I don't have to defend only one very narrow reading, which, like, this would be totally fine if that was just one or a couple of things. But the problem is that for Carrier's version of mythicism specifically to go through and end up being very probable, you have to do it with so many things at the same time, right? Like, he postulates several interpolations that are not a majority view in biblical scholarship. He, of course, postulates interpolations in extra biblical texts. Yeah, like these kind of things start adding up, and if you start tweaking the numbers in his probability estimate, then yeah, you would probably end up with a probability that is higher than 50% in favor of historicity, to be honest.
That's interesting how you said that. It made me think, because I guess what I was going to ask is, technically, if it was born of a woman, as in like the Hagar stuff that Galatians talks about, as if it is allegorical. You mentioned that if like there's a lot more to the story, there's so many more areas that we have to hurdle. And if the explanation is not as clear, like you have to put it in the lower heavens, or you have to have it, instead of it being the Romans, it's demons or something, and you can make a case, but at what point, this is where I think the debate starts to happen, is over these details. If, let's just say, Carrier was right, totally speculate and say Carrier's right on most of his assumptions that this is mythology and that it is in favor of this idea of the angelic concept of Jesus, etc., does that still take away from historicity? And at what point would you draw the line and say, okay, if he was right about this many things, then mythicism would be the case, but I'm not convinced that he's right about these things. Is there any way you could format that? Or
That's a good question. I will think about it. Because like I can go through there is a lot of different. So in my mind I have the same table that he has in his book with the Bayesian estimates, right? And I've kind of tweaked some of those parameters because I like disagree with him on a couple of points to its like different degree, right? And there is a lot of different ways how you can tweak the table, and it still gives you Jesus being more probably fictional than not, right? So yeah, like I can maybe imagine, like I can imagine him being correct where I don't think he is, or like we have a different opinion, a different view on that. But I would have to see like how it ends up, and there is probably like multiple different ways that eventually get you to the same conclusion. Yeah, yeah. I mean, then of course, like going back specifically to Paul, then of course, much more interesting question is why is it the case that there isn't a single bullet in Paul's letters, right? Like why is it the case that Paul doesn't unambiguously mention Jesus on earth, right? Because yeah, all of these passages can be read ambiguously. Sometimes you have to like stretch it a little bit. Sometimes you have to posit an interpolation to actually get rid of it, get rid of the problem completely. Because in some cases, if the passage in question was in the original text, then mythicism is very, very improbable. At least it's improbable that Paul wasn't talking about a guy on Earth. So yeah, I mean that's a completely legitimate question that like New Testaments have to answer anyway. And even if they think that Jesus probably existed, it's still very important to ask why is it the case that Paul isn't apparently interested in talking about him, right? Yeah.
it would be interesting, and dude, I'm sure you probably have enough to do in your life than to sit here and make charts for everything. But I would love to see like where you take the points that can weigh in for or against, and kind of do a calculation and say, if he's right about this point, then this and all the other ones he's wrong, or whatever, and you could take it through and show like if one of these points ends up going on the side of historicity, or it teeters back and forth based on the calculator, which at the end of the day the calculator's great, but it's just a model trying to figure out whether there was or wasn't, and that's what's interesting about this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some people who are doing that. Like, like I know at least one guy who is drafting essentially a book in response to Carrier, and he is thinking about basically like tweaking the numbers the way how he sees it, which is fine. Like Carrier actually recommends this, people doing this in his book. Like he says, okay, these are my estimates, and if you think the numbers should be different, then by all means come up with your version. And this is why I like Bayesian reasoning so much, because it's like obviously everyone understands that the numbers are just, it's not like hard data. We don't actually know any of these probabilities, but it's a very nice mental representation of the way how you think about various arguments, right? Like if you put a number on it, then it makes your thinking transparent, and you are less likely to make inference, like errors in inference, because yeah, Bayesian epistemology, the inferences that we make should follow some principles of probability in order for them to be valid. I was obviously thinking about doing the same thing, but the problem is I have to go to work every day. And to be honest, I was thinking about like where should I put the attention, whether it's counter apologetics or Jesus mythicism, right?
Yeah.
Because I agree with Carrier that there hasn't been any good defense of historicity, and I absolutely think that like in 10 years, I would probably be qualified enough to write it. But I asked around what people want me to do. Like, ask them, like, if you had to pick between me debating career about Jesus mythicism or me debating, I don't know, Mike Lacona about the resurrection. Pretty much everyone said, do the resurrection.
Yeah.
I think probably because people think like Christian apologetics is more harmful. So it's more important to combat it, even though it's not necessarily the way how I think about it. So yeah, like now I'm much more thinking about anti-sign coincidences than like First Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16, I think.
Honestly, that's a huge question on this channel, the historicity, but I'm going to tell you that's not all this channel's about. And we've been growing and evolving as a channel. I'm trying to bring in different things than just this. In fact, when I reached out to you, I wasn't even like, honestly, I was not trying to even have I wasn't even trying to say, hey, come talk about the historicity. I always ask guys who are interested in stuff like this to come, but like, I want to do a show where we do talk about the undesigned coincidences, because there are people who are non-believers that are still using a methodology, what I like to call a harmonization methodology. And I'm not certain they should, because a lot of these people who have deconstructed may not have read some critical scholars who take a book at a time. They look at authors, and then even within some of those books, how there's different authors that helped compile some things like that. They don't even look at that. What they do is they read a passage in Matthew 24, they run to Luke, they jump over to John, they read from Acts, they go to 1 John, they jump to Revelation, and it's like, they think all 27 are organically developed together as a unified message that was purposely placed, almost like divinely done, or like 27 of these guys sat together. Really wasn't 27, because Paul wrote at least 7 according to critical. But you know what I mean? Like, there was this big huddle, everybody huddle up. All right, so here in this passage, I'm going to write. Like, it's almost like they developed this perfect system and flow of story. And they don't look at stuff like Acts is trying to cover up possible issues in the early church, or that it's copying from the Euripides and the Bacchae, and like different elements that, I don't know, that critical scholarships come in. I'd love to have you do that.
This is very unfortunate, because when people do that, and obviously the most extreme examples would be like very fundamentalist Christians who just think these are like reports by eyewitnesses. Right? I heard a guy recently who thought that Acts was written specifically as like a legal document for Paul's trial in Rome before the emperor. Right? So like, what do you say to that even? Like, if you have this kind of mindset, you are missing on so much in that literature. Like, because I do genuinely think, even though I've been an atheist my whole life, that the New Testament is fascinating, like a lot of other pieces of ancient Greco-Roman literature is. But if you have this kind of approach, you are missing out on so much like a value, artistic value, and like intellectual value that's in it, right? Because like, if you actually think about the New Testament in terms of what I personally think a lot of people agree it actually is, like different authors adapting existing stories different ways because they have different points of view and they want to communicate a different message. It's such a rich tapestry, and you can like look at like so many different interesting aspects of it that just don't exist even. It's not even on the table if you, for example, think that these are like reports by eyewitnesses or anything like that. Right? I think even like critical scholars who are obsessed with the idea that there is a historical core in the text, and you have to kind of sift through it and discover the golden nuggets of things that actually existed, are also missing out on that, right? Like, because I think it's a literary creation. It's based on, it's a retelling of like a different spin on an existing story. Right? It's like a movie version of a superhero comic book, right? It's the same material but told differently. And like if you think about it that way, it's much more fascinating.
I don't blame you one bit for putting your energy towards the counter apologetic.
Yeah.
I would too, honestly, because you and Carrier, as much as you have your differences, you guys have a lot in common, and I think you're both trying to fight the same fight in terms of trying to show, hey, look, this literature is not what you think. You have totally different conclusions on some things, but at the end of the day, I think your bigger fight would be, and it'd be better to go with the counter apologetics. And I've been seeing your graphs and the things that you present, and man, I think for me, getting people to see the light is that deconstructing and coming to where we are today and starting to realize this is literature and not being so fundamentalist that God's speaking to me in my mind and telling me to do things, well, God told me to do, or, some people go to that extreme and they hurt people, or they don't take science into effect. I mean, we're seeing it today, and I'm not trying to throw this out there. I guess I'm going to say it anyways, but there are people who are absolutely against any type of vaccination. Okay. A lot of that is religiously motivated. I'm not talking about people who are not. You have your opinion, that's fine. But there's religious motivation behind a lot of things that I guess when you start to come into the 21st century, you kind of go, that's archaic. It's time to, start to come out of that. And I think it'd make us better humans. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's important to say that I'm not like primarily motivated in combating religion, because, like, for example, I happened to be born in a country that has been measured as the least religious in the world consistently. So, like, my entire family, including, for example, my grandparents, were never religious, and it's not like usual here. So, for example, I never had to go through like the process of discovering that one of the key core aspects of my identity that I've believed for like years isn't true. So I was never like frustrated with that. I never had the feeling, for example, that other people deceived me about that, which is something that people who came from especially like very fundamentalist branches of Christianity very often say, right? Like they acknowledge intellectually that, for example, their pastors don't know any better themselves, but they still feel like they were lied to, essentially. So I didn't go through that. And the reason why I do this, first of all, is because it's fun and I'm weird like that. And the second reason is I think it's very important for people to have like a solid epistemology. And yeah, if you have a good epistemology, I think you will deconvert away from Christianity as a byproduct, right? So it's not really the goal. It's just something that happens as a result. And yeah, if you are like, different Christians draw the line differently, but it's very often the case then in order for you to stay in the religion, especially in some of its more extreme versions, you have to habitually deny like objective empirical reality. And if you train yourself essentially to do that, or other people train it in you, then you'll start doing it with other things, right? And as you mentioned, there is a lot of probably disproportionately many anti-vaxxers in, for example, evangelical Christianity. There is like political conspiracy theories that's completely insane right now, right? In that specific segment of the U.S. population.
Flat Earth is another conspiracy.
Yeah, that's essentially completely religiously motivated, right? Like I know some flat earthers try to hide it, but yeah, I mean, if when push comes to shove, they believe it's satanic deception, right?
I know some people who are non-believers who are flat earthers. I'm not even kidding you. I'm dead serious. But mind you, they all come from fundamentalist Christianity as they deconstruct. I don't know if their epistemology is the same, but they don't trust science. They think that NASA's lying. They're just huge anti-NASA, people. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in the devil, but they recently, within the past, I'd say year and a half, deconstructed. And I don't know if they're still doing that or not in some ways of their thinking, but yeah. I don't know. Like I came from I was told this was all factual and historically true. And you mentioned on a show with Doug that I thought was awesome when you were using the undesigned coincidence, and we got to do a show on this sometime. I would love for you to bring your charts too. I understand you've already done it on his show, but I would love to do another one with me and go into other examples, because right now that's a very important thing. I don't know if you know that Dr. Carrier also wrote a response, and
Of course, I am his Patreon, by the way, so I get all of the stuff in my in my feed. Yeah, I think it was a very nice takedown. Like there is a couple of things how you can approach it, and he did what I think should be done. He's very well qualified to do that, which is just going through the individual examples and showing why this is not valid within the context of New Testament scholarship. But what I was like, the different idea that I had in mind is actually finding undesigned coincidences, like using the exact same strategy that Christian apologists are using when it comes to the Bible, and actually showing that you can find undesigned coincidences in other ancient myths, like Greek myths, for example. That we have some myths, for example, about Electra and Orestes, that exist in several different versions. So you can compare them. There are, of course, differences. And what do you know? You can always harmonize the contradictions, and you can always find undesigned coincidences. And this is something, for example, that people did with the Bible code as well, right? So at some point in the past, there was this craze about the fact that if you take the Bible, the Old Testament in Hebrew, and you arrange the Hebrew letters in a certain way, it suddenly starts spilling out meaningful strings of sentences, and it's like talking about JFK assassinations and stuff like that. And people thought that this is deliberate, and that they didn't understand that if you have a large data set, you are statistically determined to start getting meaningful, like apparently meaningful data points just by pure coincidence, right? Like it would be actually weird if it wasn't there. But a very effective point how to show it to lay people is to take a very large body of literature. I think it was done with War and Peace by Tolstoy in Hebrew, and they just showed that the same Bible code is there as well, right? So it's like kind of like an argumentum ad absurdum. So yeah, I haven't done it very extensively. I might dedicate some time to it, and when I have a couple of examples, that would be interesting. And you know what's great? You plugged the Discord server at the beginning, so of course the people on the Discord server watched those conversations as well, and they actually started giving me examples themselves. Because if you start thinking as a Christian apologist, then yeah, you will start finding these undesigned coincidences elsewhere. They came up with undesigned coincidences in Star Wars. They came up with undesigned coincidences between the New Testament and New Testament Apocrypha, which is super spicy because, of course, Christian apologists don't think the Apocrypha is historically reliable. So I think that's an alternative way how to talk about this.
Yeah, you actually mentioned that and said, well, if they're going to concede, then they might as well start conceding that the miracles and other religious stories are true as well. And you made the point. That's a logical conclusion. And when I started to deconstruct, what I did, my approach to deconstruction was different than some of the people I've talked to. I started seeing that Jesus was very much, at least the gospel narratives were fictional, and they looked a lot like other stories. That's what helped me deconstruct. And it made me start to go, okay, so am I saying that Osiris and the other deities that are similar in many ways, not identical, I'm just saying there are similarities to their dying and there's rising and there's miraculous claims, etc. Is my Jesus special? Is this the one and only? And that was, it took me a year at least to try and get through saying, okay, Hercules and Samson, for example, they're so similar. There's so many things that overlap. this character, Samson, the strongest man who ever lived, and Hercules, the strongest man, I started to see that my Bible was also similar to other stories. And then Christians, the apologetics, of course, will say, but the Bible's the oldest version and all the others copied from it. And it's like, that's some measures of apologetics. The other ones are what the early church fathers tried to argue, that Satan knew that the story of, that Jesus was coming, or that God was sending his son, etc. So he made these counterfeits. And I mean, come on, there's so many different things, but that was my path. And
Yeah,
I think, I must admit, I think that's when I got into mythicism, because it's easy to go from my Jesus is concrete and 100% accurate to, oh man, I found so many problems right off the bat that I went to the opposite spectrum. And I went to complete far fiction and said, this guy's completely fictional. And now I'm beginning in my journey to try and find any historical reliable things and put the pieces back together. So I went to the far end, and now I personally am heading back towards, okay, there was a temple's destruction. All right, Josephus describes. I started getting into more, if that makes sense,
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a like okay approach, right? And the funny thing is, like, if the metaphysics of Christianity isn't actually true, then this is like so what you would expect, right? Like you would expect it to be a product of its own time and the circumstances in which it emerged, right? This is
Right.
what we are seeing. Of course, it's different because like every religious system, every system of ideas is unique, but it's of course like fits into its specific environment. You can see, like, Christians can see it, I think, usually pretty well with other religions, right? Like not many people actually know that when Joseph Smith, came up with the Book of Mormon, it was already widespread, the idea that the Mesoamerican civilizations were actually Jewish, and they were descendants of Jews who came to Americas. It was the lost tribe of Israel from the Middle East at some point in the ancient past, and there was even a lot of different ideas about historical records being written on golden plates, right? And what do you know? There is a guy who comes up with this kind of story, right? So yeah, Christians usually can see how you would expect Mormonism to look like that if it wasn't actually true. And I kind of see it with Christianity as well. The problem is that Christians usually don't know that much about ancient history in general, like particularly ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman history outside the Bible, right? Like they wouldn't, for example, read other ancient literature like Greek, Roman of the time to notice those kind of similarities. Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up really good points. And like I said, and like he said, there is a Discord group where they hang out and they talk about these things, and they're open to ideas. You guys can share them. They'll try and steer you in the right direction with their research. I'm very appreciative that you came on to share your information and what you think about some of these things and prior probability. So if you guys check out the book, of course, and you see what Carrier has written, you can understand where Camille's coming from and why he starts with a different prior probability, which will come to a different conclusion. And then, of course, there's the details, like the differences in arguments into the actual details, which we didn't have time and won't have time. It would take an entire program, probably 2 hours easy, to go into details and why. And
you can do an entire show about every individual piece of evidence. And I have to admit, right off the bat, that I'm not even qualified to talk about a lot of the stuff. So I kind of have to take a Carrier on his word, right? Because are not that qualified. But yeah.
Well, I really do appreciate you coming on. The show's evolving, and you're one of the reasons to help this show go in the direction, that I'm trying to head, and that's opening up. I'm even challenging and having debates on this channel. I'm trying to bring it into more mainstream as well, not just ideas that don't make mainstream. So I really do appreciate you coming on and sharing your information. Like I said, everybody, Doug from Pine Creek, go subscribe to his channel. You'll see Kamil, you'll see Cam, and Doug himself. He gives Pine Creek points to anybody who gets there first. And I like his show, man. He's entertaining, and he just takes you through the mind of a Christian. And pause. Did you guys catch that? You know, like he like talks with you through it. Like, no, where did he come up with this? Like who, you know, it's really fun. So please show them some love. Just to give everybody who's watching this a little tip, if you like the videos, if you comment on the videos, and if you, of course, subscribe to the channels and stuff and watch the whole video through, YouTube promotes that content. So if you're a fan of Doug's channel, watch his videos. Well, I don't have time. I only have 10 minutes and he's going to go for 2 hours. Play it incognito or play it on your phone. Turn the volume down. It helps this type of content grow. And you'd be surprised. I mean, before you know it, these channels will get this content out there, because that's what we want to do, is try to help the world become a better place, and to leave, at least leave fundamentalism alone, you know, because you can't, once you challenge this stuff and you see it in your head, there's no way to keep to the fundamentalist approach. It just doesn't work. So do you have anything you'd like to say to the audience?
Yeah, just last thing I'm going to say, if you ever want to have a debate about Jesus' historicity, then I'm game.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm not the guy to debate you. Okay, I'm
Sure. No, yeah, I understand that. Yeah,
Yeah.
but if you can't find anyone who would be willing to defend historicity, then I think it would be fun. Of course, like if it was hypothetically against Carrier, I would have to read his books.
Right.
I don't want to do that. I've read them like historicity like 3 times, proving history probably twice. I have like 0 time, unfortunately, to do something like that. But we'll see. You know.
Well, thank you for being respectful in your approach on the criticisms that you do bring to the table, because too often I see, you know, people throw dung or it comes across a little abrasive. Instead, what you've done is you've presented valid points on why you disagree. And I do appreciate the respect, because that's one thing that a lot of people don't have, is have a cordial discussion on topics they disagree on. And you did really, really good on that. And thank you so much for that. Also, I don't know if I could, I'll talk to Dr. Price. He would be the only guy, and I don't even know if he debates anymore. But Dr. Price,
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah, because he's you know, it's not the youngest. Maybe godless engineer, right? He's kind of profiling himself on mythicism, at least initially. You know, we'll see.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind hosting it. I can tell you that. And if it gets out of control, I'll hit that mute button.
Okay.
But thank you, man, and send my best regards to Doug and Cam, and thank you guys for what you're doing. I hope to get you back on. We can talk about some of these undesigned coincidences and other materials that you have. So when you get a YouTube channel growing, let me know. I'll put that down in the description. And you guys make sure you show them some love. If you guys see any more material come from them, help them out. Thanks a lot, brother.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep. And guys, don't forget, we are MythVision.